I did.
Oh, look at that. Now I can just moderate and it focuses on you
No,
two.
that
How
no,
about
don't like that.
Yeah.
Don't like that.
Whoop, I'm gone. Oh, I'm back.
Oh, let me change connection.
Oh, we've already got some viewers. Hi, viewers. Welcome. People must have been waiting. I love it. All right. Sonya, have you and Logan gotten to see the Batman yet?
What?
Have you and Logan gotten to see the Batman yet?
Yes, we've seen it 3 times.
Wow.
Yes. Nathan, you have seen it once or twice?
Still just only once.
Still just once, and I've seen it twice, so there you go.
Yeah, we
Sonya,
saw it in Texas. We saw it twice here, like in different types of theaters and like.
So you hated it, is what I'm gathering.
Yeah, it was horrible. No, So Batman is probably my favorite DC character, and Wolverine, hence my son's
Obviously,
name Logan, is my favorite Marvel character.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, that's where my son was named after. So
I love it.
Except he's tall. He's not short.
Oh yeah.
Like
Did you see there was a news bite this week that Oscar Isaac said that growing up his favorite superhero was Wolverine because Wolverine is short and he is short?
No, I didn't.
Representation matters, folks.
That it does.
Nathan, who is your favorite DC character?
I'm sorry? What was that?
Your favorite DC character?
Oh, I'm supposed to have one of those?
I mean, I didn't know. It's not required. Just making conversation.
I don't know that I've ever actually thought about that question before in my life.
This genuinely surprises me.
Yeah, no. I mean, I guess by default there was Superman, but Superman's lame. So as far as just like inertia, then it would be Batman because there was between the Super Friends and all of the 18 movies and all of that good stuff.
He
there's a
pummeled
lot
you
of
into
Batman
submission.
around.
Yeah.
Basically.
What about Marvel?
Spider-Man.
Okay. That was my guess.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, my favorite Marvel character is Doreen Green, the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. You see her back here? There she is, folks. All the powers of a squirrel and a girl. Hey, Stacy.
That's a lot of power.
Stacy is the one who actually turned me on to the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. So, hi, Stacy. Welcome. She was like, if you're not reading this comic, you're making a huge mistake with your life. And I was like, well, I don't want to be making huge mistakes with my life. So, and she was right. She was correct. So, yeah. Yep, there she is. See? All right, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. Well, I guess, we can wait a few minutes for people to traipse on in. So, yeah, favorite DC character? I mean, it's Batman. I know that's basic, but he's great. He's the best.
Gotta love billionaires beating up the mentally ill for a living.
I know, right? It's true that the whole formula is broken, and it's been fun to watch more socially conscious writers try to figure out a way to make that okay.
Right.
When it's just fundamentally not okay, you know? Yeah. The closest they could come is like, oh, go ahead, Sonya, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. You can finish.
I was just going to say the closest they come is like, but he's also mentally ill, so maybe it's okay. Still not okay.
Yeah, I think I actually did like Wonder Woman when I was really little. And so like when Linda Carter was Wonder Woman on TV. So, and then I think when the Batman the animated series in the 90s, and that's when it like I think just the whole storyline and how it was written. So when I watch a movie, I base almost everything off of the series
Yeah.
of that. It's like, is it comparable to this?
And the new movie, you know, World's Greatest Detective, we kind of got close, pretty close.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Yeah.
Guhei, hello, welcome. How's it going?
This is false advertising, as she does not speak any Spanish.
I mean, she at least knows one word of Spanish, as demonstrated in the chat with hola, hola, hola. So I think that was maybe a bit of an exaggeration.
Only the smallest bit of exaggeration that is possible.
We would say un poquito exageratio, I believe is how you say that in Espanol.
I can verify at least 2 of those 3 words.
Can I tell you that my wife, who is fluent in Spanish, probably the thing that I do that she hates the most in the world is when I speak my very not real Spanglish, where I just add O's and Ah's to the end of every word, and it drives her crazy. She hates it so much.
Exaggerito sounds more Italian or something. Like
I went with Latin, but it is a Romance language,
yeah.
so you know. All right, well, enough silliness. It's 7:05, so we'll get started. Welcome, friends. Welcome to our conversation on reparations. I'm J.R. Forasteros. I'm the lead pastor at Catalyst, and I have the privilege of being joined by Nathan Ross, the worship director, up there. Well, he's up there for me. I assume he's up there for. I assume everyone sees what I'm seeing because I'm in control. I can disappear but keep talking like that, or I can come back. And then also Reverend Sonya Brown, who preached this past Sunday on this very topic. So we have no plan, really. We just wanted to have a freewheeling conversation here. I have some questions and talking points, but we're just going to kind of go where the conversation takes us. And if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat, the live chat, wherever you are, whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube. And we will absolutely incorporate those questions or comments. Certainly, if you have questions, I'll ask them to Nathan and Sonya, and they will dispense their wisdom upon us. So, let's return. Let's go back to Sonya, your message from Sunday. I would love to hear. So folks who don't know how the sausage is made at Catalyst, so to speak, when it comes to the preaching team, we have a calendar where we have all of the upcoming preaching dates and scriptures and topics and all that kind of stuff. And I would just send an email to the preaching team, and I basically say, first come, first serve. Go in there, take a look. And I think like 2 minutes after I sent that email out, your name was already by this sermon on reparations. So I'm curious, was that just like a good weekend for you, or was there like were you in particular drawn to this particular topic? Like what is there anything worth talking about there? That's my question.
I was drawn to this particular topic because I've never been a part of a church community that actually talked about reparation or even was ever provided the opportunity to discuss it. So as soon as I saw that topic, and then it fit into my calendar. So yeah.
So you just jumped. I loved it. I told you when we were working on it, I was super jealous that you took it because I was also excited about it for similar reasons. But yeah, Nathan, I'm curious. You know, you're also working back there behind the scenes. Did you get nervous or sweaty when you saw we were doing reparations, or were you just like, whatever, it's fine. This is what we do here?
I had the same reaction that everyone that I've told about this series has had the reaction to when I list off the different titles of what God is not, and people are just like, "This is a church? Like a church is doing this? Like what?" They're very confused because, yeah, I've definitely not heard reparations talked about in any substantive manner or in much of any manner at all. And I've been in a lot of churches over my life, and yeah, it was very intriguing because also it's one of those words that is exceptionally loaded. People have very, very strong and visceral responses to it. And so I was intrigued to just see from the Bible, like what the Bible has to say about this idea. And so I thought Sonya did an amazing job at really kind of breaking that down and making me think about it in different ways as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. Like, Sonia, even you had a scripture that talked really clearly about the idea of reparations, not necessarily on like the cultural scale that we're going to move to talking about here in a few minutes, but certainly as an integral part of the process of healing the wounds caused by sin, the wounds in a community, right? So still not at an individual level, but at a communal level, this idea of restitution or reparate, again, whatever word you want to call it that doesn't trigger you, fine. But right, like this idea that there are tangible harms that are created by sin, and part of the reconciliation and healing process is making those right. Like this is very clearly in the scripture. So do either of you have a sense of like why it's so shocking that a church would talk about these things, or why all three of us grew up in churches and have not heard this talked about?
I think there's always a disconnect of, well, what I was told whenever we bring up Indigenous issues within the church was that's not a conversation that we should be having here. We should be talking about God, but then I think there's that lack of connection to see that this justice and reparation is very much a part of God's work in the world to redeem, restore, and reconcile humanity back to Him. And I feel that the more and more that we read, especially how the people of Israel read the Old Testament as a community, so it was more communal in their understanding of how to read their the Old Testament or their scripture. That was very formative in shaping the individual and the community over. It's not solely the individual, but how what they do affects the community as a whole. And I think when we return to that is, it should be a conversation we should be having in the church, that it's not something that is like taboo or anything like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that's very true. I know in the broader church context of the history of the different denominations here in the States, there's a lot of overt codified, to reduce it down to a word, racism, that is built into uh, the country and specifically the institutions. And one of the biggest ones is churches. And that is, it's an equal opportunity racism. It was very specific to basically the majority of groups of people that weren't from very specific, didn't originate in very specific places in Europe. And so on an actual tangible level of literally in the rules of different conventions like the Southern Baptist Convention or other denominations, there's a lot that has to be kind of pulled out of that and kind of torn down a bit and rebuilt. And so obviously it's 2022. It's a long ways off from when pretty much everybody could agree that it was, actively something bad. But between, the 60s and now, there wasn't like, oh, we have to re-examine our policies. We have to re-examine the actual things. It was more so just, okay, let's kind of adjust slightly, and then that's it. And so there was no actual process of restitution. There's no actual process of we have to, go to the drawing board and kind of reassess, take apart everything to go and keep what we need to keep and remove what we need to remove. So a lot of that is still intertwined in just the culture. Even if they've been successful in removing it from the rules and from being listed, it's still very prevalent in most churches that there's a general traditional culture of church that doesn't really allow for that sort of thing, which is why many preachers have said that Sunday mornings are the most segregated hour in America. But many people still say that because that's also still pretty true. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to kind of dive in there.
Yeah, I want to follow up there with a question from Guhe. She said, "Do you think it has something with the urge, something to do with the urge not to assign blame for systemic issues?" So I think this gets to what you're talking about, Nathan. Right? Like, there's if we built this machine to do something specific, and the machine we turn it on, and then the machine just does it without someone having to stand there and push the racism button, right? Like, then is it my fault? Right. And if the machine's just over there doing it.
Right. I that's definitely very true that a lot of people born today and living today feel like that's other people long ago that did the bad things. And so what does that have to do with anything right now today? And yeah, it's very much not if you're saying, oh, there's a problem, then that can feel like saying, oh, I'm the problem. Which, I mean, I don't want to do that myself. Like, I'm not going to just voluntarily be like, oh, yeah, I'm the reason why everything's messed up. But I feel like it's very easy for people to just attach those two things of trying to work for a solution, but then acknowledging your role in the problem. So yeah, I would definitely agree that it does have something to do with that.
So I have a couple thoughts I want to throw in, just in my experiences in evangelicalism, and being a white person, sort of learning about race and my role in living in a racialized country and all that kind of stuff. One reason I think we struggle to grasp what for the biblical authors was fairly apparent, which is that reparation or restitution is an essential component of healing, is that we have abstracted justice because we're a nation of 327 million people, right? I mean, when you think about the people who wrote the Bible, like, Jerusalem in the days of King David was maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people, right? Like which we would say is like, that doesn't even count here in Texas, right? We're like, that's not even I don't think it's even a real city if it's only 1,000 or 2,000 people, right? You gotta at least get to 10 grand before you count. And that was the capital, right? That was you go out into the rest of the towns, you're talking about villages that are, 2 or 3 or 4 families. And when I say family in the biblical sense, I mean, right, like, there's maybe 20 to 25 people living under one roof under a patriarch, so you've got 3 or 4 of those who live together, and that's a village. So, if we're all the leaders of our town, we are the judges, right? The heads of the family are the judges. So if Bobby breaks a law, well, it's your kid or my kid or Sonya's kid, and they hurt someone else in the town, and we are not dragging them before a judge wearing a powdered wig, banging a gavel, offering some abstract sentencing of a fine. We're saying what needs to be healed between Bobby and the person that he wronged, so that our community is flourishing again. Whereas again today, like the last time I had to go to court is for a speeding ticket, right? And I had no idea who the judge was. I didn't know this person. They didn't know me. They weren't like, can you please give me your life story and help me get to know you and the mitigating circumstances for why you have a lead foot. And, they didn't care how much Mario Kart I played and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, it was it was purely just, you broke this abstract law, we're going to give you this abstract fine, you pay that. And like, I know in the abstract, like it probably goes to, repaint lines on a road in the city somewhere or something, but like there's no immediate connection to, I wounded someone by my behavior, and so this recompense that I'm making is going to heal that wound, right? So like, because we live in this society where our justice system is so abstracted, and it's really not really concerned with making everything equitable. It's balancing the scales of Lady Justice, right? She's holding scales and they have to be balanced. It's not about what do I need to be whole and what do the people I hurt need to be whole. It's about, paying your debt to society, as we say. So I think that makes it hard then when we read these biblical stories and this logic of restitution and recompense is operating, but we miss it because we just don't have those same cultural assumptions, and then I think it's just really hard to think systemically if you weren't raised to think systemically. And I think the further up you are on the pyramid of American privilege, the less you have to think about systems because you're on top of the systems, right? The systems were built to benefit. I'll stop saying you and I'll say me, right? So I don't have to think about them because the output is always what's good for me. And so then I can work hard, and my hard work gets me further because of all of the head starts that I had, right? So I think it's hard even from the get-go for individuals and for churches to even think about reparations as something that is essential to the biblical witness. And again, Sonya, I want to echo Nathan. I think you did a great job on Sunday illustrating that is the case, though. The call for biblical justice is this serious accounting of what wrongs were committed and how those wrongs wounded us. So could you take us back to the story of Zacchaeus? Because in the live chat, a few different people on Sunday were saying, hey, I think that I've never heard the story of Zacchaeus as a story about reparations. And you even said, like, before working on this message, that was not really, like, we think of Zacchaeus as, we have a little song, right? He's a wee little man, and he climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see, right? We focus on, I think, as you illustrated on Sunday, all the wrong parts of the story. So maybe for folks who weren't there or just who get a recap, can you, like, a real kind of brief summary of Zacchaeus and where you read reparations into that story?
Okay. Well, first I wanted to go back to the question where we where we don't talk about sin of that was passed on. So I think one of the great examples of amending sin is, so I really was really taught about like the environment growing up of like care. And there's a horticultural group that was talking about the Russian olive tree, of how it was planted throughout the United States as a way to it was a fast growing tree, like in the early 1900s, to help like with the wind and to help with hopefully with erosion. And so on the Navajo reservation in Canyon de Chelly a couple years ago when we went to visit, they were doing this huge effort to get rid of the Russian olive tree because it was actually destroying a lot of the plants that are indigenous to that area. And so this horticulture group, I forget where they're from, but it's talking about within the United States of how we inherited the sins of our ancestors with the Russian olive. And now we have to learn how to address the issue of this plant. And so when we think of it, like we have to, and then the only way you can actually get rid of the Russian olive effectively to bring about regrowth is you have to destroy it at the root. Like you have to, and they said you have to work really hard. And so when we were at Canyon de Chelly and the Forest Service was there, cutting down and burning the trees, was saying that it has to be like, once you start, you have to just keep going. You have to keep working in order to get rid of it, because it destroyed a lot of the cotton trees. And then it actually started making ditches to where the water was going throughout the whole entire canyon. It was just making these ditches. So that's the things that they were trying to correct. And it was so interesting that they were making that effort, but to correct these things that we thought were good, but now they're finding out that it's actually bad and it's actually destroying the environment that was intended to protect. So I think that's where we get this, and when we see this whole picture in this context of how we have to correct what our ancestors did is just to restore and to bring about healing to the land for what what their efforts are trying to do with the Russian olive and how to mitigate further damage. So I think that's really important to see that as a church, that's what we're even called to do as witnesses of Jesus, is to bring about this wholeness, this newness, and this restoration. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. And yeah, so that's one way to look at healing and how we've inherited sins from our ancestors that we didn't do it, but we see the damages and the effects in creation that it's causing. And it's not just on the Navajo reservation, but it's throughout the United States that this has occurred. And so with Zacchaeus, that was Luke 19. And what I did explain was that he was the chief tax collector. He had a lot of money, and it was gained by cheating and exploiting the community that he was a part of. And it was, so if he's a part of a community, he's taking from his neighbors. And we always focus, like you said, on Jesus climbing the tree, but that's only just a short portion. And we're like, why do we always focus on it so much when we shouldn't? But we do. But then Jesus tells Zacchaeus, come down. He's going to go stay at his house. Zacchaeus is excited. But everyone else in the community is upset because they know who Zacchaeus is. And like, why is Jesus going to go sit with the sinner? So they're not happy. But then Zacchaeus, like, just when he went to go seek out Jesus, he's moved to the part that he responds to Jesus, that he says that he's going to take whatever half of his possessions, give it to the poor, and that anyone that he's cheated, he's going to repay them 4 times as much. And that I repay, that is written in the text is in present tense of where that practice is happening right now, and how he's going to go forward with his community, that he's not going to be that person he was.
Yeah, I think it's so, I think if we even talk about the way he responds to Jesus at all, we treat the whoever I cheated, I will repay 4 times as this act of incredible generosity. But Nathan, I wonder if you could speak to this a little bit, since you're a business guy and money things. But like, if Zacchaeus is cheating, I mean, if he's basically robbing people, if he's taking wealth out of their homes over a period of years, they are losing more than just the amount that he has stolen from them.
Yeah. It's definitely, when people sue companies or sue various entities, and they sue them for things, within that it's over the amount, but then they also usually include in that, lost wages, lost potential earnings, because, obviously they were without that money during the periods of time that they were. And so maybe they could have invested it, maybe they could have, gotten interest, maybe they could have done a lot of different, maybe the quality of their life just could have improved and could have opened up more opportunities. So yeah, it's definitely something that is more than just that specific amount. So not really something that's just an overabundance of goodness. It is actually something where that's, we have current modern precedent for that being the case. I did want to speak to real quickly that one of the things that kind of grabbed me about this message in particular was the very personal nature of reparations. And so for me, it's like thinking about times where I've just made mistakes and like I've messed something up or, just, just messed up. And a lot of times it's like you feel really badly and, you apologize and that's what you're supposed to do. And then the other person, if they are a Christian, then it's like, okay, you do the Christian thing, which is, you forgive that person and you know, and then dot dot dot. It's like, I guess move on is the what you're supposed to do. But this was very illuminating because it's like, no, it's not supposed to just be that. But that in our personal lives, like for me, when I go and whether inadvertently or just straight up just sin, and that affects someone else, that I also need to put in the work to restore and to make that right. And so that was really because that's not something that I typically think about when I think about reparations or restitution. But that was
Yeah, so I want to transition us into talking about this more at a national cultural level. But what I don't want to lose is the relational model. That again, that when the Bible talks about the necessity of reparation, it's because there has been a relational wound created. And I mean, I would think, right? Like when I have hurt someone that I care about in a way that I have caused them loss, I want to, fix that loss. Like, I don't know, I'm going to make up a dumb example, right? Like if Nathan and I are out and he's like, hey, will you hang on to my wallet? I gotta run some, I don't know why he'd do that, but let's say he did. And then I lost his wallet and it had $100 in it. Right. I would want to give him that $100 back. Right. Not because I'm afraid he would like hate me forever if I didn't or something like that, but genuinely because I love Nathan, I care about Nathan, and it's my fault that he experienced that loss, and so I want to fix that, right? I want to make that right in this case a very easily tangible, measurable way, right? Ben Franklin. That was a lot of times, as we're going to talk about, it can be a lot harder to quantify, but in that case, like it's very easy to quantify. Yeah, Sonya, the story that you shared about your dad and his granddaughter, your niece, I thought another really good one where there's this like very measurable, tangible loss that has happened, right? Leftovers, and so obviously he can't like go get leftovers, but he replaced it with another meal, right? It's just I think it's a very natural thing to want to do when you care about someone, and I think the trick when we start talking about reparations at a national cultural level is how we lose that relationship, right? How we lose that the slip there. So let's move to that conversation a little bit, and maybe we could start here. I'd love to hear from either of you if you recall the first time a national conversation about reparations, specifically, obviously, mainly for slavery, but also, Sonya, I wonder if there's what this conversation looks like if you're aware of that, like for Native people. When was the first time you were aware of such a conversation? And if you feel, I don't know, like how serious do you think we're taking that as a nation right
now? I've heard of reparations, not necessarily in that term, ever since I was little and interacting with non-natives, especially when I began traveling to like other places. And that was one of the things would be like, oh, well, don't Native Americans get money? Don't they receive money for what happened to you? And I would just wonder, recall, I don't recall receiving a check for anything. And so I'm like, well, if there's somewhere I'm supposed to sign up for this money, please let me know because I've never received anything. Or
So there
I
was
would,
you were encountering assumptions that people already assumed
yeah.
this was a thing that was happening.
And then I would ask my parents when I would get home and be like, hey, like, so what happened with this? And this is what they said. They're like, oh, yeah. And they're like, no, that's not what happened. And so my mom, she would explain to us. She didn't really know about it, but then we just ended up like researching it on our own, like, and just finding out that I think it was the that there was in 1946 around World War II, so before my parents were born, that there was these like lawsuits against the United States by a few tribes in regards to damages against their Fifth Amendment rights, and then their seizing of the lands, and then just the inadequate compensations that were supposed to be given to the indigenous people, but were never given. So then in 1946, they set up what's it called? The Indians Claims Commission that was supposed to review everything. And so that was kind of where people would say, oh yeah, you got like $1.3 billion for this. But then it was only like less than $1,000 a person back then in 1946. And out of all the lawsuits, that only 29 of the claims that were brought to the Claims Commission, only 29 were awarded damages, and like over 200 were dismissed. So whenever we say reparation to bring about healing or renewal and restoration from the get-go, it didn't happen that way, where it was very much dismissed. And then even with whatever money was always given, there was always like Congress or some type of law or policy that was in place saying that the indigenous people cannot take care of their land. So they were always awarded someone to watch over this finances, which then it was always like misused, mishandled by that group, where the tribes, the people who needed it, never received it. And that's even like in one of the books, what was it called? Killers of the Flower Moon. They kind of talk about that in regards to how there were always someone they were always thought as children where they couldn't take care of their money. And
Had to have a
so,
white person come in there and hold the purse strings.
yeah.
Literally, it was, yeah, that book is, that book wrecked me. Like, I had no idea. Talk about stuff that I was never taught, for sure. Yeah, unbelievable. So, Nathan, what about you? Yeah, what's kind of been your history with this conversation?
Well, I had a lot of exposure to it from a fairly early age. Just in a lot of books that I read, a lot of just primary source books from scholars and activists from the I was going to say from the 50s and 60s, but also from the 1890s, 1900s. But like, yeah, like it's been a common refrain for a while, as well as I mean, specifically in the Civil War. That's where the idea of a 40 acres and a mule comes from. Is that one of the I always forget this guy's name. One of those Union generals
It was
who
Sherman.
liked raising and pillaging things. But yeah, he was out here, offering, 40 acres and a mule to free slaves. And so this idea that you get a starting point for being able to be a person now, as opposed to property, which is what you were for hundreds of years. So that's always kind of been there. I think as far as the discourse around it, it's typically It's typically considered to be uh, a non-starter politically, and so and a great many black uh, leaders or aspiring politicians or people in kind of influential spaces, a lot of them have taken the path of trying to just get a seat at the table. And so getting a seat at the table means not being radical. And reparations apparently is radical. And so that is anyone that has tried to, you know, get get to those spaces. So everyone from Jesse Jackson, who had a viable presidential campaign back in the 80s, going all the way up through Barack Obama. You look at pretty much anybody that is trying to be serious on a national scale, they at best kind of softly punt it, but typically just say like, yeah, no. And again, it's because of this idea that is kind of culturally hardwired in for a long time. It's it's a bit of a part of what's called respectability politics, but basically this idea that if you just do well enough, if you're well spoken enough, if you're educated, if you're two times better to get half as much, you'll get that half as much as opposed to nothing. And so there's not really any sort of, I was going to say groundswell, but there's plenty of people on the ground that are very much in support of it. But the people that have gotten up into positions to be able to try to do something about it, the vast majority of them are not going to go for that because, again, they're worried about maintaining that seat at the table, which means maintaining more or less the status quo.
This will shock both of you, but my first real exposure to reparations was a skit in the Chappelle Show. I know that's shocking that I had not come across it before then, but I would say my first serious engagement with it was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Atlantic article in 2014, The Case for Reparations, which I think in a lot of ways put this conversation, it elevated it to a place of a lot of people taking it more seriously. I think in part because of how thorough, and I'm going to use a cuss here, but in its correct biblical sense, how damning his article was. Because he illustrated not just going back to the Civil War and saying, okay, so you have wealth that was generated in these plantations that was held entirely by the white plantation owners, and yet it was generated entirely by the black enslaved persons who lived there, right? You have, and again, he didn't even go here, but we could talk the same about native peoples, right? You have them working that land, the plantations on this land that they took by means of genocide from native peoples who either were eradicated or were forcibly removed to reservations, right? And often this land was given out for essentially free, as a way of the U.S. government encouraging people being white people, of course, to settle further from the established cities on the East Coast. And so not only do you have that, and so you have all of this tremendous amount of money that at emancipation just simply exists in America that was generated primarily by and because of non-white bodies.
Yeah.
But then you have this, let's give everyone 40 acres and a mule, which happened for 5 minutes, right? Until Johnson came in and said, no, we're taking all of that back. Then introduced sharecropping, which was functionally slavery, right? And so then Coates goes through and he says, let's talk about emancipation to civil rights, right? And let's look at systemically housing, education, economics, every institution that you want to talk about in America that is responsible for some kind of wealth generation. There have been policies like federal policies, state policies, and local policies that have actively prevented persons of color from receiving the same access to wealth and wealth generation that white people had access to. Right. So So we're not even just talking about the fact that people didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. We are talking about that, but we're also talking about the fact that from then until now, there have been systemic reasons that persons of color literally cannot have the same access to wealth that white people have. And so there is a real, tangible, measurable divide, right? And this is another thing that was kind of it was a big shock to me, as a big aha moment, and it's something that I hear a lot of people say, but things are better than they were, which is true, right? Like life expectancy, hell, it's all technically better. The issue is it's better for everyone, right? So yes, it's better for Native people. Yes, it's better for Black people. But it's also better for white people. So you have to ask the question: is the gap closing? Right? And that's where on almost every metric the gap is the same as it was at emancipation, which that is insane to me. That is a crazy fact that Native people, Black people, Latino people trail behind white people by the same margins that have always been the case, right? So we haven't actually done anything to heal that gap, to heal that wound. And to me, that's where this comes back to being um, a relational conversation, right? Sonya and I were talking about this as she was. So I'm not trying to put you on blast, Sonya, but you said you really like there were a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into this sermon. This was like a lot for you. And so we talked through things a couple of times, and one of the things that we talked about was how, if I don't see the two of you as my siblings, then it's easy for me not to care that you don't have the same access to things that I do, right? It makes me a monster, but it's easy for me to be a monster. But and not to spoil this coming Sunday's sermon on family, but if I see you as my family, right? Like when someone messes with my brother, I'm going to mess with them, right? If someone messes with my sister, like I'm going to mess with them because they're my family, right? And if I see you as my family, which I think that's one of the beautiful things about the church is incorporating us into a spiritual family, then the things that wound you should wound me. And the things that disadvantage you should enrage me. And I don't know. I think I have not seen the same anger and organization around the idea of some kind of reparation from white people that I have from persons of color. Because I think, as a rule, in general, I know hashtag not all white people, whatever. But as a rule, we don't feel that same pain. We don't say your suffering is my suffering, your pain is my pain. We say, well, that's not my fault, right? I didn't own any slaves. I didn't kick anyone off their land. Yeah. So it's a, to your point, Nathan, it's a non-starter, right? People are just like, well, how would you even do that? And it's hard. It's complicated. I don't know. I don't have a degree in economics, right? But we use that as a way to sabotage the conversation before it even starts.
Yeah. I think definitely that's in general for a lot of issues in this country, that's such a big problem. That's such a big thing. How do we even go about fixing that? It's like, what can you do? You know,
Y'all know
shrug.
we landed on the moon, right? Like
Literally.
yeah, we can solve pretty weird problems if we care enough.
Not only did we land on the moon, instead of just using pencils like the Russians, we designed a pen that can write with no gravity
You
because
right.
that's
Yeah.
just how exceptional we can choose to be when
Yeah.
we focus our energies and, more importantly, our money on issues. And I think that is one of the things when it comes to like us collectively as individuals, is that it's easy to see something like that and say, that, what? That doesn't, how would that even work? You got to go and like track down everybody affected by, all of these different things that have happened, all these injustices. And, there are so many because unfortunately, American history is pretty much 90% injustice, against so many different groups of people. And so it's like, where do you even start? How do you keep track? Where do you go from there? And like then if it's like getting money to people, well, how would that even work? And it's all of these different things. But then at the same time, we literally just, are in the middle of a pandemic in which we're managing to get, 4 to 8 tests to every living American household. We're able to, get vaccines that are free of charge to everyone that needs them here. Like there's a lot of things where it's like, how did this happen? And that happened very quickly and was able to be made happen. And so it's very easy to get lost in the scale and the scope. But again, we are the wealthiest nation in the world, and we are that way because of the terrible things that were done. 100, 50, 40, 30 years ago.
We're getting a couple of questions in the chat. So, question for you two: what would make you feel like reparations was something that was getting started, or at least that the tide was turning towards this being taken seriously?
I think at a church level is acknowledged that within the Old Testament and even within the New Testament, that sin was individual, but then also sin was very much communal. So there was always this communal repentance of sin. And when we discussed on Sunday this atonement of sin, this guilt offering, that it went to the person, but then also there was the priest that was involved who ensured that things that take place as it should have been. And if this individual didn't address the sin issue, that they would have, since they were always worried about holiness, since God dwelled with them in the tabernacle and everything followed them, that God literally dwelt physically with them. I think we have to be reminded as a church, we are supposed to be reminded that God does dwell with us as a community, also as an individual, when we come together, when we separate, that how our injustices to other people tarnishes God's name and who he is. And how do we go forward at a national level? I think how reparation occurred was always like, let me do this for you in return. You have to do this for me. In regards to Indigenous communities, when they would award the money, they either had to put the money in trust, have other people manage the finances for them. And the other thing that occurred was that if there wasn't given to beneficiaries, that the Indigenous people had to relinquish their claims as Indigenous people to where they are not federally recognized anymore, which also has a negative effect in regard and has really affected a lot of communities who didn't know what that really meant and what was going to happen. And they see that they have no claim to any land. Not that we have any, their sovereignty is taken away, is what basically happens. So they say, yeah, like, oh yeah, you had this happen, but then it wasn't done to where it was meant for healing. It was just meant to, here, let me give you this money, but also since you're getting this money, you have to, any other claim, I guess, kind of like in a lawsuit, like you just give up all rights after like a car accident or something like that. Like you can't do anything else. You can't refile this or anything else.
Yeah, for me, I think that nothing has happened in this country by osmosis or just out of momentum. Every hard fought battle for any right that we as the people have was a hard fought battle. Even things that have been codified from the beginning, things that were amendments, all of those, every single one of those things was not just, it didn't just happen. And more recently, if you look at the civil rights movement, that was something that was started and sustained primarily by two groups of people, children, or people under the age of 25, basically, and the church. And so that's not the entirety of both of those groups, because especially in the case of the church, there was a lot of opposition, but that is what sustained that movement over many, many years, over several decades, actually, and caused change to forcibly happen, which makes sense because who should be most concerned with justice than people who claim to follow God and who claim to want to be like God? And God, over and over and over again, has very, very clear thoughts and feelings on justice and what's right. It's very clear, how God feels about that. And so any 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 shift, any tide turning, any of that, that all has to start, with the church. Like that has to begin with that has to begin in congregations, and how this is talked about or dealt with. Because the problem is not even, oh, we need to have churches be able to start talking about reparations. We need to have churches start being able to talk about race. We need to have churches start being able to talk about the mass genocide and terribleness, towards indigenous people in this country, who, again, another topic in which don't know that I've ever really heard it spoken about, in churches. That's all, none of that is ancient history. All of that is history, but none of it is ancient. It's all fairly recent and fairly relevant, and it matters. And so to be able to to be able to look at something like restitution for just these massive wrongs, these gaping wounds, you have to start being able to approach that entire conversation and be able to frame that in the context of our God, of our faith, of Christianity. Because I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday, that I feel like a lot of people find it fairly easy to reverence God and make God bigger than everything. But God is omnipotent and omnipresent, and also, small enough to go with you in any situation and in everywhere. He's big, and he's also, and so we lose that when we try to compartmentalize our God and our church and our faith, and we try to make that a safe space to go into and just have this lovely world, this lovely space. Like, yay, it's going to be like heaven. We can be happy and sing our songs and get rejuvenated, and then fight off the terrors of this life and of this world. And it's no, that's not how that's supposed to work. We need our churches to allow God to be God and their faith to be their faith in every aspect. We need to not say, "Oh, leave your politics at the door." No, you can lean however you want to lean, but you should still be able to look and see, is this something that lines up with my God, the God of love? Is this something that lines up with these precepts in every aspect of our life? So when we have a community that is able to do that and take that approach, that's when we can actually do things and actually start to shift and move towards a place of actual reconciliation. Which there's a often the only time that race is talked about is when there's unrest, and then there's a summit that is always under the title of racial reconciliation. Um, and so it's not that, it's biblical reconciliation, which is righting the wrongs. So once we're able to just more collectively take those steps together, I think that's when, that tide can turn, and that's when we can actually start to have some preparation.
I want to throw out an example because I think they can be helpful, right? When people are like, well, what would reparations even look like? So in the chat, Andrew wrote that his family currently lives in a former sundown town, and many of the residents pretend the past never happened or could happen here. If you're not familiar with the terminology, a sundown town is called a sundown town because non-white people were told that they should not be in town by the time the sun went down, or they would be lynched. And so, as you can imagine, there are not very many people of color who live in former sundown towns because they have this long history, right, of actively excluding folks. So I'm going to hold up a book and then I'll put it in the chat. It's called The Color of Law. The subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's by Richard Rothstein. It's a pretty good sized book, but it goes through a pretty comprehensive history of how the federal, state, and local governments in America passed laws and, again, legally created separation. I think there is a pretty what feels like a common sense idea that people just like to live by people that they're like. It's actually a racist idea, and it's not true. The reason people live by people that they're like is because of laws that made it that way. And so you look at something like a sundown town, you had both actual laws on the books and then these unwritten but still very much enforced laws. I have a friend who's a pastor in New York City, in Manhattan, and recently he had a new deed. His church paid for a new deed to be drawn up to their church building because it was old enough that it still had language in it that the church building could not be sold to black people. Legal language in the deed, right? And so he was, and it's the kind of language that gets ignored today. Like if a black congregation wanted to buy the church, no one would have been like, well, sorry, we have, its language just gets ignored. But he said, we wanted to make a big deal out of this at our church, that this is the history that we have. He's a white pastor. He said, this is the history that we have, and this is literally written into our document, so we want to take it out. So if we're talking about reparations, one thing that it could look like would be like a first-time home buyer's credit specifically for people of color, because the government gives all kinds of home buyer's credits, right? You get all kinds of tax breaks. The government wants you to own a house. There's all kinds of reasons it's better for society if people are homeowners. And so the government wants you to own a house, asterisk if you're white. And so a way to dismantle that would be to offer specifically homeowner credits, first-time homeowner credits to persons of color. Make it really cheap. If this former sundown town wanted to seriously repent of its history and start making restitution, they could set aside parcels of land that would be for sale or for donation to families of color that wanted to build homes there or buy homes there for super, super, super cheap, as a way of saying, we understand what we've done, and here is a tangible, that shouldn't be the only thing they do, to be clear, right? But this would be like a very tangible way of expressing what we did was wrong, what we did created segregation and oppression, and we are working to stop and make that right. And you can do that kind of stuff at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, because it was at all of those levels that this specific kind of homeowners oppression happened. And again, if you look at the research and statistics, it's basically still the same today. It seems like every week there's a new news story out about a black couple that went around looking at homes, and then they sent a white couple in their place to the same home, and they got like a significantly lower offer to the white couple. Right. So housing discrimination continues to be a massive thing. And again, when we get into talking about homeowning anyway, we're talking about land ownership, which then ties directly into Native issues. Right. So all of these things are really, really, really intertwined. And yes, it's complicated. But Nathan, I love what you said about you and Sonya both, right? You both said the church needs to be an organization that is leading us to imagine better. Right, we should be the place where people who are part of our worshiping community have the best imaginations about what these very complicated ideas could look like. Our educators that are a part of our community, our health professionals who are part of our community, our realtors who are part of our community, right? Everyone's coming together and dreaming together and saying, this is a complicated issue, but we landed on the moon, so we can probably figure it out, right? Together
that was
we're
a long
strong.
time ago.
That's right. So hey, we're gonna wrap this up, folks, because it's been an hour. But if you have any final comments or questions, please drop them in the chat. I want to give Nathan and Sonya a chance to just offer some final parting ideas or words, and then we will. If you have any more questions, I'll throw them out as well. But Nathan, any final thoughts or words?
Uh, yeah, I mean, to what you said, as far as with housing, there's uh, it's known as racial restrictive covenants, and you can actually that book is a great read, and you can also literally just Google racial restrictive covenants in your state, which for me is Texas, and you'll find news articles from as recently as 2021 discussing that because that is very, very real. It's very, very alive. It's very, very present in our day to day. And so I know that conversations that can involve history uh, can feel very abstract and very much like they don't relate to today, but it's very real. Often not just in the ways of, oh, like this effect that still lingers, but literally still here, still a part of our laws. Um, and so that's something for us all to look at, starting on a personal level of in our relationships, how we are trying to live in a godly way, which means paying restitution or reparations for when we have wronged someone, and then taking that from ourselves and our community to how we can engage in our systems that way, in our government, in our politics, in our even our workplaces, in all systems, because again, all of these things were co-opted and co-signed by all facets of society, all of the systems. That's all of the corporations, the government, that like go down the list. It was all in all of that. So try to um, look into learn as much as you can about it, but then on both sides of that, as far as the holistic view nationally as well as for ourselves, and I think that will really help us move in the right direction.
I got a question before we have Sonya finish this out. Obviously, you can both speak to this. So, a few years ago at the United Methodist Conference, sister denomination to us, the conference leader acknowledged and apologized to Indigenous people for the atrocities put on their people. Are you saying there should have been a second step? If so, like what would that maybe be? What could a second step be?
Uh, I think the United Methodist Church has actually done way better than the denomination that we're a part of in regards to reparation, of how they've acknowledged it, that they've um, even like have special offerings and these like special like announcements that they give in regards to highlighting the Indigenous people, which not many denominations do. So, in that part, I feel like they're working towards the step of acknowledging and lifting up Indigenous people within the United Methodist Church, even to the way of having them rethink how worship should be more contextualized for each tribe that they're a part of. And so they've done better. And I think that that's a good starting point. Also, how can, not that all missionaries are bad, but within ministry, we talk about discipleship so much, but yet the church is always predominantly still in the hands of the Anglo, in how we view the church and how it works on a literal contextual level, that it's predominantly westernized. And I believe that causes a lot of harm, to where you can only work within these boundaries that are already set. And boundaries are always in place of that limits the freedom. And with Indigenous people, Native American people, the biggest thing is sovereignty, that self-governance. And that really plays an important part within the church structure as well, because that's part of our livelihood, and that's the oppression that is predominantly felt. And that's why it's such an important topic within Indigenous communities, of this self-governance, of how they can help, they know their people, how they can go forward better with their people, but then also not to exclude other cultures, because there are other cultures that live like on the reservations now, but then how can they create even a community within that to uplift everybody who is now part of that community, and that not everyone's full Native, that like even within my family, there's family members who are half Black, half Hispanic, half Native. So I think just working towards that. And then how, I think one of the questions was, how do you feel like reparation is at least starting? I think just to know that I'm not asked ridiculous questions like, oh, weren't you given money already? So you should be fine with that $1,000 that was given out in 1946, I guess. And just to say that a lot of that injustices, that further research needs to be done to say like, oh yeah, that was done, but there was all these other policies that were in place to where not everyone received it, that it was abused, misused, and that it was still in the hands of the white people. And there's still, that's why there's that's why I think there's still that call to reparation, because in that biblical sense, there's not that atonement and that healing that ever came about, any sort of reparation that already did occur.
I would say, with regards to a second step, because it's, first step being acknowledging, which is, a big step. Uh, that would be, I think the whole point of this sort of process is that they would need to figure out what the second step is. That part of that is then exploring that further and saying, okay, how can we help? How can we as a conference, and convention, a community, how can we now rectify the inequities that are present due to the terrible things that happen? And obviously that looks differently for different groups and with different backgrounds and histories, but that would be the step, is for them to assess, research, learn, and get inflamed with that righteous zeal to try to correct the problem. And there's not a necessarily like a pat answer for what that is supposed to look like, because again, we are communities and we are bodies, we are local bodies, and so that's going to look differently in different places. But that would be the next step, is doing the work to figure that out, basically.
Yeah, and I think when churches don't do that is where we get in a lot of trouble. It sounds like the UMC might be already engaged in that. Really looking and trying to figure out how to put their money where their mouth is, to put it crudely. I know the Southern Baptist Church did not do that. They made an acknowledgement, an apology for racism, but then did not do anything to explore how the fact that they were literally formed as a denomination to enable slave owners to be missionaries, shaped them going forward. And so when race became a big issue culturally, the Southern Baptist Church really retrenched as a denomination back into a lot of their racist roots. And when you asked people about that, they said, "Well, we're not racist. We apologized for that." Right. So it was very much this. I think, Sonya, in your sermon, you called it like a self-defense apology, right? Where by making this acknowledgement, they felt like they had done everything they needed to do. Whereas, it was primarily churches that ran the native boarding schools that destroyed so many native cultures. It was theologians and church leaders that were authorizing and encouraging the slave trade.
That were members of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's right. So
Yeah.
I think our churches need to do that really hard work of taking the accounting, right, running the numbers, putting some real numbers to it, and then having that hard conversation. Well, what do we do about that? How can we begin the process of making that right? And obviously, it's always wise to, if they are willing, include the people that you've wronged in that conversation, so you're not just making more decisions for the people that you've wronged. So, Sonya, any other final thoughts, insights, comments?
No, I don't think so. I think
just... Well, you've shared so bountifully with us already, so that's fine. All right. Well, thank you so much, folks. This has been a real joy. Thank you especially to Sonya and Nathan for your generosity and your time. And thank you to everyone in the chat for engaging with us, for following along. This is going to be, obviously, it's recorded. It's up on the internet now. So if you come across it at a later time and want to reach out to us from the future, we'd love to hear from you. Fire up a DeLorean or fire up an email. Either way, it'll get to us. So thank you so much for listening with us, for participating with us. And we see this very much as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. So please continue to be sensitive to that and to continue to worship with us. In the meantime, Sunday is God is Not a Family Man. So we're going to be continuing on in that vein. And we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, grace and peace be with all of you.